Thank you for the invitation to come and make my presentation today. It's always good coming back to York. As was said, I did my undergrad and MA at York, and I worked with Dr. Johnson, who's been my supervisor and considered mentor. So it's always good coming back. So today I'm going to be presenting a small part of my research so far. It is ongoing, it is unpolished, so your feedback is highly appreciated. I will present information or the narrative of three women, medical women in Jamaica, one of whom her history or her story or narrative is tied up with the traditional healing systems in Jamaica. Now I'm trying to extricate the traditional healing systems and look at it in a more health care healing system, even though it's difficult to extricate it from religion. Because Afro-Jamaican religiosity is really a huge component of what this woman, this barnyard mother does. But I'm going to just try to look at her from a more health point of view. So the presentation examines the historical perspective of three Afro-Jamaican medical women to make broader historical connection to the history of health and medicine in Jamaica, as part of the British Empire. The temporal focus of my presentation is between 1850s to 1890. A period that is mired in the struggles of free people who attempt to define freedom based on economic, social, cultural, and political terms, and leading up to the Marant Bay Rebellion in 1865, which is kind of a watermark of Jamaican history and the history of this period. The epidemiology of disease in Jamaica is instructive about the evolution of its public health system in response to morbidity and mortality. Western medicine, considered the gift of European colonization, was a demonstration of British liberalism connected to the white man's burden, and was used as a tool of conquest and colonial control and expansion. Although women were active participant in this emerging public health system during the post-slavery period, their voices remained silent in the archives. This is my attempt to awaken these voices or illuminate the history of health and medicine through their voice. This paper argues that even despite the paucity of sources, meaning these women a lot of them don't create document or don't leave document behind, therefore we don't know their thoughts and feeling. We only extrapolate from what we are told by ethnographers or anthropologists, or from their contact with colonial officials. This presentation aims to ask a question: to what extent did the lived experiences of Afro-Jamaican medical women matter in charting the medical history of colonial Jamaica? The historical perspective of Black women and women of mixed heritage are usually garnered through the lens of elite in colonial society, or through, as I said before, the perspective of upper middle class scholars such as anthropologists and ethnographers, who often interpret their actions based on their own personal value system. Since enslaved, poor, and illiterate women do not typically leave written document, scholars rightfully extrapolate about their experiences based by examining their action within the colonial setting, or by critically reading those contacts with colonial officials. Afro-Jamaican medical women offer a unique perspective in examining the history of medicine in colonial Jamaica through their roles as informally trained nurses or folk or traditional healers. In a stratified political society, women of mixed heritage enjoyed a superior status to black women. During slavery and the post-slavery period, some local medical women of mixed heritage worked as freelance nurses, doctors, tavern owners, lodge keepers, and lodging housekeepers in the urban and port cities. This class of women were defined by color and their connection to European men through paternity, as well as mistresses. Conversely, black local medical women who performed the role of elderly or middle-aged traditional healers, granny midwives, herbalists, seers, obeah women, maialists, and barnyard mothers are often perceived on the fringes of colonial society, a threat to civilization, if you will. The craft of their trade was magic and poison, indications of barbaric cultural practice that were dangerous and must be curtailed. Therefore, as caregivers, black women and women of mixed heritage were often perceived historically as mediating colonial rule in subordination to medical men, or as counter-hegemonic to Western medicine. However, the post-slavery reality were more complicated than these polarities indicate. Some local female healers, such as midwives and freelance informally trained nurses, straddled the boundaries between these polarities, therefore navigating a pluralist system of healthcare that drew an inspiration from Afro-Jamaican healing system, as well as Western medicine. So the first, I'm skipping ahead, so the first Afro-Jamaican medical woman I'll introduce you to is Cuba Cornwallis. Now, she was an enslaved woman. She was born in slavery in the 18th century. There are no specific information about her. For example, we don't know for sure when she was born. We know when she died, only because of what happened from part of her life to the end of her life. So she was a former slave, housekeeper, and alleged lover of Captain William Cornwallis, from whom she got her name. There are few documents about her 18th century life as an enslaved woman, probably because she couldn't read or write. She was one of the voiceless, marginalized black women recognized as one of Jamaica's first informally trained nurses. Her value as a nurse was gleaned from the perspective of the elite military men to whom she provided medical treatment or was otherwise connected. Her thoughts and personal worldviews remain silent in the archives. We learned about her from those who encountered her as patients or as guests in her lodging house in Port Royal. She was mentioned, for example, in letters by one of her most prominent patients, Vice Admiral Horace Nelson, who praised her skill as a nurse for her kind-heartedness. Nelson was stricken with dysentery in 1787, and he was recommended by Cornwallis's, I guess then, she was his housekeeper, and he was then taken off ship right to Cuba's house, and there she treated him and he recovered. So, the historical perspective of Cuba is limited to those who encountered her as a nurse. We can guess at our belief in Afro-Jamaican healing tradition, since we're told that she used herbs, Jamaican herbs, to treat Nelson along with isolation and heated blanket. However, we do not know for sure how her beliefs influenced her practice as a medical woman. According to the website blackpast.org, references to Cuba indicates that she relied on healing practices associated with Oba. This statement is problematic for several reasons. Caribbean scholars have argued that obeah, nihilism, revivalism, and pocomania were often indistinguishable to colonial officials and even to some local residents. According to Orlando Patterson, in Jamaica, obeah was considered sorcery, using charms, poison, shadow catching, etc., whereas nihilism was used to reverse the harm caused by obeah. This distinction between obeah and nihilism therefore could indicate that Cuba's magic was more associated with nihilism than with obeah. Or it could have been that she wasn't associated with any at all. So the connection with obeah is based on the fact that she used Afro-Jamaican herbal products to treat her client. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll move to my next character. Mary Seacole, many of you may have heard of her. She is, of course, a prominent Jamaican nurse that has been seeing some controversy, not of lately, but for the last little while. So Mary's story is that she was born in 1805 in Jamaica of mixed heritage. Her mother was a Creole Afro-Jamaican bush doctoress and owner of a boarding house in East Kingston. Seacole represents an example of an informally trained medical practitioner who sought to expand nursing or doctorsing beyond the boundaries of Jamaica to the British Empire. So she traveled to places like Panama, and she was also involved with Crimea. We know about Seacole because she published her memoir autobiography, which is entitled Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Maniland. So because of that detailed account, we know much more about Seacole. According to her biography, she blended travel and medical practice and international entrepreneurial pursuits through travel to Panama, London, and Crimea. She expresses personal perception about race, class, and nation, even if censored. She did not identify with the black masses in Jamaica, even though she had something to say about the limitation of gender and race. Scholars make the point that Crimea was responsible for defining modern nursing through Florence Nightingale's nursing skill, her administrative skill, and selfless devotion to humanity. Seacole may have demonstrated selfless devotion in the care of the sick and injured, yet her critics did not see her fit as the perfect nurse. However, she did achieve her goal of providing care in Crimea. Her account, therefore, is a narrative about determination and fortitude in the face of racial, class, and gender differences. And I'll skip to my last. There's a whole spiel about to show you how the development of the epidemiology of Jamaica in terms of epidemic. There's a cholera epidemic that happened in 1851, and right after that, well, not right after, but 20 years later, there was the smallpox epidemic. In between that, there are, different diseases like yellow fever, malaria, pneumonia, and all kinds of other diseases that was prevalent during this time. And it was a time when the Jamaican public health system was emerging. Now, you have this disease environment, you have freed people who were exercising their right to choose, you have a health system that is so deficient that I think it's Patrick Ryan who said in 1861 there were about 50 physicians on the island. This compares with 200 doctors in 1833. So you can just see the scenario that was happening here. And the people, they must have been really going through a lot of shock, dealing with the adjustment to freedom, dealing with all these diseases and epidemic, dealing with a competition with indentured labor that was brought into the island at the time. So I'm just trying to tell you that the situation, the socio-political economic situation was really in a disturbance. It was really unsettling. Bearing in mind the small number of doctors on the island, people have to look after themselves. They had to seek alternative. So here I'm bringing Roseanne Mammy Forbes, who was a barnyard mother. So her story is as follows. So Rose Ann Forbes, known as Mammy Forbes, operated a well-known barnyard at Blake's Pen at the border of Manchester at St. Elizabeth since the 1870s for about 60 years. A barnyard is described by a scholar as a healing center specializing in herbal medicine, a place where sick are bathed in herbal mixture, right? And that is as per Leonard Barrett in his work, Portrait of a Jamaican Healer. Ethnographers such as Beckwith, Martha Beckwith was an American ethnographer who went to Jamaica for, I think it was a year, in 1919 to 1920, and she studied the folk culture, and she reported that. So barnyard mother, as the Forbes indicate, that they were responsible for the healing of rural people who were responding to the unhealthy and the scary situation that was happening at the time. The Forbes represent 3 generations of women. So there was Mammy's, there was her mother before her, and her daughter. And they each, I guess, passed the knowledge about herbal remedies onto each other and then perpetuated themselves accordingly. Okay. So the narrative about these 3 generations of barnyard mothers who practice in the revivalist tradition, and I must back up here too. Revivalist tradition, there is a whole evolution to that. So you remember I talked about obeah and nihilism? That was outlawed in 1760 by the colonial government, so it went underground. But it reemerges through this time when I was talking about this unsettling time with diseases and all the disturbances that was happening. It reemerges through what was called the Great Revivals. The Great Revivals were between 1840, there was one, and then 1861 there was another Great Revival, and it was just a moment of time when people were getting in all kinds of frenzy. I look at it as more therapeutic, but I guess I would need to do more of the work to kind of analyze that. So suffice it to say that Annie Forbes, her Mammy Forbes barnyard was serving a purpose. Although revival leaders such as barnyard mother and shepherds represent a more benign syncretism of European and African religious practice when compared to obeah or nihilism, it was deemed a threat to colonial hegemony and Western progress. The fact that Mammy and her husband were charged for practicing medicine without a license indicated that their practice was linked to healing. It therefore seems credible that revivalism can be perceived as a means of circumventing colonial rules. Practitioners incorporate Christian rituals with Bible scriptures, baptism, and fellowship with African religious rituals of drumming, singing, dancing, and spirit possession, somewhat similar to Native Baptists, in order to stay below the radar of the colonial government. Right? The barnyard mother also did individual consultation. I know time's up. She also does individual consultation with whoever was suffering from whatever ailment in the community. They could come and see her, and she would kind of work with them, offering them whether it's herbal treatment or a bath. A bath would be made from herbs, and they would be washed in this bath. Okay, so let me wrap up. The female informal healing practices may be perceived as ambiguous and problematic for contemporary scholars because of the lack of information. Frankly, we don't hear their voices mostly. We don't know what they're thinking. So we can only extrapolate from what we're here or what we're told or what we read about ethnographic studies. Yet the narratives of and about Afro-Jamaican medical women suggest different questions about health, healing, medicine, and well-being, and the representation of a more inclusive historical perspective of the past. For those reasons, these are areas of studies that must be looked into. And they must not just be looked in an isolated type of way, because that's what I notice most of the scholarship do. They kind of look at Afro-Jamaican religious practices, and healing tradition is a part of that. What I would like to see is it incorporated in the overall history, medical history of the country. Now, is that naive optimism?
Yes.
Or is that possible? You tell me. Thank you.